No one in the crowded room paid attention to Hunter Brooks, the quiet man standing near the back wall in a plain uniform, his eyes calm and unreadable. When sudden gunfire tore through the executive floor, chaos swallowed every department head within seconds. CEO Grace Harrison was forced down onto her knees, her wrists trembling, her breath shallow. Her shaking hand found Hunter's sleeve and she whispered 4 quiet words. They took the hostages. That sentence changed everything behind his eyes. The harmless driver everyone ignored began studying every exit like a man who had done this his entire life. Harrison Dynamics occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower that overlooked the financial district, a company built on decades of defense contracting and quiet government trust. On the morning the world would later remember, the entire executive floor buzzed with attention that had nothing to do with weather or traffic. Grace Harrison, 33 years old and barely 4 years into her role as chief executive, was preparing to sign a contract worth billions, a deal that would secure the company's military artificial intelligence division for the next decade. She had built her reputation on sharp instincts and relentless preparation, yet even she could feel something wrong in the air that morning, though she could not name it. Hunter Brooks arrived early, as he always did, dressed in the same plain uniform he wore every day as a contracted driver and logistics aide. 35 years old, soft-spoken, and almost invisible to most of the staff, he moved through the building with the kind of quiet efficiency that nobody bothered to notice. He carried boxes, checked manifests, opened doors, and disappeared into hallways without leaving an impression on anyone who passed him. Most employees did not know his last name. Fewer still knew anything about the life he had lived before he ever set foot in this building. Connor Blake, the company's director of operations, made a habit of mocking him in passing. Connor was 45, polished, ambitious, and deeply insecure beneath a practiced charm that worked well on investors and board members. He would toss a remark at Hunter in the hallway, something about fetching coffee or carrying bags, always delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Hunter never answered with anything more than a nod. He had learned long ago that silence cost him nothing and revealed even less. Madison Reed, Grace's closest assistant, was the only person who seemed to notice anything different about him. She had caught him once near a stairwell door, his eyes tracking the camera angles with an intensity that seemed out of place for a man whose job was to carry luggage. She mentioned it to no one since there was nothing obviously wrong with a man checking his surroundings. That morning, the air on the executive floor felt different in ways easy to dismiss alone but troubling when added together. The hallway cameras blinked, then steadied, as though someone had briefly interrupted the feed. The guards at the lobby desk rotated earlier than usual, replaced by unfamiliar faces nobody questioned, since uniforms tend to erase curiosity. An employee swiped her badge and the light flashed red twice before turning green. Cell signal dropped in patches near the conference rooms, a small inconvenience several employees blamed on aging infrastructure. Hunter noticed every one of these things. He noticed the camera flicker because he always watched for camera flicker. He noticed the new guards because their stance was wrong, too rigid, too alert for men who were supposed to be bored. He noticed the badge failure because it matched a pattern he recognized from another lifetime, one where access systems were quietly compromised before anything dramatic ever happened. He said nothing. He simply filed each detail away, the way he had been trained to do years earlier, in a life nobody in this building knew existed. Grace moved through the morning with her usual composure, reviewing notes with Madison, confirming the final details of the contract with her legal team, and preparing herself for the most important meeting of her career. Connor walked beside her for a portion of the morning, offering reassurances about the investors who were scheduled to arrive, men he claimed to have vetted personally. There was an edge to his voice that morning, a faint unsteadiness that Grace attributed to nerves about the size of the deal rather than anything more troubling. By mid-morning, the lobby had grown quiet in the particular way that large buildings grow quiet before something significant happens, a stillness that nobody could quite explain but everyone seemed to feel. The investors were due to arrive within the hour, a group Connor had personally arranged and personally vouched for, men whose credentials had been confirmed through pathways that later would prove to mean nothing at all. Hunter stood near the back wall of the executive lobby, dressed in his uniform, holding a clipboard he did not need, watching the elevator numbers climb toward the top floor with the kind of patience that came from years of waiting for danger to announce itself. The doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft chime that nobody else seemed to register as significant. A group of men in tailored suits stepped out, carrying leather cases and wearing the practiced smiles of men accustomed to boardrooms. Grace stepped forward to greet them with her hand extended and a welcome already forming on her lips. Hunter did not move from the wall, but his eyes shifted to the men's hands, to the way they held their cases, to the small bulge beneath one man's jacket that no tailor could have hidden by accident. The meeting began the way countless meetings before it had begun, with handshakes, polite introductions, and the rustle of papers being laid across the long glass table. Grace took her seat at the head of the room, flanked by Madison and two members of her legal team, while Connor settled into a chair near the investors with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than mere acquaintance. The leader of the group introduced himself as a representative of an overseas fund, his accent smooth and rehearsed, his eyes scanning the room with a calculation that had nothing to do with finance. Within minutes, the calm shattered. The man who called himself an investor rose from his chair, reached beneath his jacket, and produced a weapon with a fluid motion that suggested years of practice rather than panic. Three of his companions did the same, fanning out toward the doors and the windows with the practiced choreography of men who had rehearsed this moment dozens of times before. Screams rose from the far end of the table. Chairs scraped backward. Someone's phone clattered to the floor. The man in charge, who would later be identified as Aaron Price, a former mercenary with a record scrubbed clean from most public databases, raised his weapon toward the ceiling and fired a single round that silenced the room more effectively than any words could have. The sound echoed through the glass walls and out into the hallway, where additional armed men were already moving with practiced efficiency to seal off the entire executive floor. Within 90 seconds, every exit had been blocked, every elevator had been disabled, and the floor had become an island cut off from the rest of the building. The internal communication system died first, a controlled outage rather than an accident, followed almost immediately by the complete loss of internet access throughout the floor. Cell phones that had flickered with weak signal earlier now showed nothing at all. Aaron's men moved with the calm of professionals who had mapped every camera blind spot and every structural weakness long before stepping into the elevator that morning. Aaron crossed the room directly to Grace, seizing her by the arm and forcing her down onto her knees in the center of the floor, his weapon pressed against the back of her neck with enough force to leave a mark. Connor's reaction stood out immediately to anyone paying close attention. He stumbled backward with theatrical alarm, his hands raised, his voice cracking with fear that seemed performed rather than genuine, though in the chaos of the moment nobody else noticed the difference. Hunter remained near the back wall, his hands raised slowly, his expression unreadable, his breathing controlled, and even while panic spread through everyone around him. He did not flinch when the gun fired. He did not cry out when Aaron's men began herding employees into a tight cluster near the windows. His eyes moved methodically across the room, cataloging details with a precision that had nothing to do with fear. He counted the gunmen first, 4 visible, likely 2 more stationed near the stairwells based on the timing of the floor's lockdown. He measured the distance to the nearest weapon, no more than 8 feet, close enough to act if the moment called for it. He noted the exits, the service door behind the kitchen pantry most employees had forgotten existed, the maintenance hatch near the server room, the stairwell along the building's eastern wall. He noted the blind spot in the corner camera that Aaron's men had not bothered to disable, a small oversight telling him this operation, however well planned, was not flawless. Aaron forced every employee onto their knees, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who expected obedience and rarely failed to receive it. Grace knelt at the center of it all, her wrists trembling, her composure cracking for the first time since she had taken over the company. As Hunter knelt nearby, close enough that no one else could hear, Grace's shaking hand found his sleeve. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, words meant only for him. "They took the hostages," she said, her breath catching on every syllable. Hunter's eyes shifted just slightly, just enough that anyone watching closely might have noticed something change behind them. He understood instantly that this was not a simple act of robbery or extortion. Men who wanted money did not seal off communication systems with such surgical precision. Men who wanted money did not bring enough firepower to hold an entire floor for hours. Something larger was unfolding, something that had been planned for months, and Grace's whispered words told him precisely where the true danger had already taken root, far below them, in a part of the building most people never thought about at all. Hunter did not move recklessly, and he did not move out of turn. He simply watched, his stillness so complete that Aaron's men barely glanced at him twice, dismissing him as just another frightened employee waiting for instructions. But beneath that stillness, his mind worked with a precision that belonged to a different life entirely, one that nobody in this building had ever glimpsed. He timed the rotation of the guards near the conference room doors, noting that they switched positions roughly every 6 minutes, a rhythm born from training rather than instinct. He read the formation of the gunmen the way a chess player reads a board, recognizing the gaps between their coverage, the moments when two men turned their backs to each other without realizing it. Grace began to notice him in a way she never had before. She had passed him in hallways dozens of times without a second thought. Yet now, kneeling beside him with a gun at her back, she watched the way his eyes moved, the way his breathing never changed, the way his hands stayed loose and ready rather than clenched in fear like everyone else around them. There was something in his stillness that did not belong to a driver or a logistics worker. It belonged to someone who had been in rooms like this before and survived them. Years earlier, in a life he had buried as deeply as he knew how, Hunter had served on a classified unit specializing in hostage rescue, the kind of work that never appeared in any public record and never earned any public recognition. He had walked into burning buildings and besieged compounds, had talked gunmen down, and, when talking failed, had ended threats with a speed and certainty that still visited him in dreams. The work had cost him pieces of himself that could never be fully recovered, and it had cost him something far worse during his final mission, when a miscalculation, not his own but one he had been unable to prevent, led to the deaths of two men under his command. He had carried their names with him every day since, a weight that never lightened no matter how many years passed. He had walked away from that life entirely after the funerals, swearing to himself that he would never again be the man who decided who lived and who did not. He had taken quiet work that asked nothing of him beyond punctuality and discretion, work that let him raise his child without the shadow of his old profession ever touching the small, careful life he had built. He had believed, truly believed, that those instincts were buried for good. But kneeling on the floor of an executive suite with Grace's whispered warning still echoing in his mind, Hunter felt something shift inside him that he had spent years trying to silence. This was not a choice he was making lightly. It was not the rush of old habits returning out of excitement or pride. It was the simple, unavoidable truth that there were people in this building who had no one else capable of helping them, and that fact mattered more to him than any vow he had made to himself in grief. Grace studied his face during the long, tense minutes that followed, watching something settle behind his eyes that looked almost like resolve. She did not understand what she was seeing, not fully, but she understood enough to know that the quiet driver beside her was not what he appeared to be. She found herself in the middle of the worst morning of her life, feeling something close to hope for the first time since the gunfire had started. It was in that same stretch of silence that Hunter's attention caught on something small near the edge of the room. Connor stood near the windows, his hands still raised in apparent terror, but his eyes kept flicking toward Aaron with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. Hunter watched closely as Connor's fingers shifted at his side, a small, deliberate motion, 2 taps against his thigh, paused, then one more. It was not the gesture of a frightened executive. It was a signal the kind men used when they did not want to be overheard, and it was aimed directly at the man holding the gun to Grace's neck. Hunter watched the exchange between Connor and Aaron with a stillness that masked the certainty crystallizing inside him. The signal had been brief, but its meaning was unmistakable to anyone trained to notice such things, and Hunter had spent years of his life trained for exactly that. Connor was not a hostage caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a participant, and likely far more than that. He was the reason this operation had unfolded with such surgical precision. Pieces that had seemed unrelated now arranged into a clear and damning pattern. The flickering cameras, the unfamiliar guards, the malfunctioning badge readers, the dropped cell signal, none of it had been random. Someone with deep access to the building's infrastructure had quietly disabled and rerouted systems over weeks, perhaps months, preparing the floor for exactly this moment. Only a handful of people held that level of access, and Connor, as director of operations, sat near the top of that short list. Hunter understood now that Connor had likely sold the building's architectural schematics to Aaron's people, detailed floor plans that included every maintenance corridor and every structural weak point. He had likely handed over the security rotation schedule as well, explaining why the substitute guards that morning had moved with such confidence through corridors they had never officially worked. The override codes for the electronic locks, the backup power routing that fed the server room during outages, all of it pointed to a betrayal planned with patience and care by someone who had spent years inside these walls building trust solely so he could one day break it. What chilled Hunter most was the realization that Aaron's men were not behaving like men interested in ransom. Kidnappers who wanted money kept their hostages alive and visible, using fear as leverage for negotiation. These men moved past the executives entirely, more interested in the lower floors than the people kneeling in front of them. Hunter pieced together fragments of conversation carried on radios clipped to the gunmen's vests, references to a server room, a data vault, files that needed to be pulled before anyone outside the building noticed the silence. The true objective came into focus with brutal clarity. Aaron's people were not here for money. They were here for the classified artificial intelligence research housed deep within Harrison Dynamics' most secure servers, technology developed for military application that foreign buyers would pay almost any price to acquire. Once the data was extracted, the servers would be wiped clean, erasing any trace of the technology's existence within the company. And Grace, as the only person with both the authority and the knowledge to expose what had happened, would not be allowed to survive the morning. Grace's face went pale when Hunter, in a voice low enough that only she could hear, explained what he believed was unfolding. She had trusted Connor for years, had promoted him twice, had defended him to the board when others questioned his judgment. The betrayal cut deeper than the fear of the gun still pressed against her back, and for a moment, she looked as though the floor beneath her had vanished entirely. Hunter did not allow her despair to linger. He began speaking in clipped, careful phrases, mapping out what little advantage remained to them. He noticed a panel near the floor's emergency lighting system, a relic from an older electrical configuration that predated Connor's tenure, and therefore likely sat outside whatever sabotage had been planned. If he could reach it without drawing attention, he might be able to send a signal through the building's auxiliary circuits, something faint enough to avoid detection but distinct enough that anyone monitoring the building's systems from outside might notice an anomaly. Before he could act on the thought, a commotion erupted near the far wall. Two of Aaron's men seized a junior employee by the arms, dragging him away from the cluster of kneeling staff while he begged and struggled against their grip. Aaron's voice rose above the panic, cold and deliberate, announcing that anyone who doubted the seriousness of this operation was welcome to watch what happened to those who wasted his patience. The young man's terrified eyes found Hunter's for half a second before he was forced toward the far end of the corridor. Hunter knew he would not get a better opportunity than the one forming in front of him. The two guards dragging the young employee toward the corridor had drawn the attention of every other gunman in the room, eyes following the spectacle Aaron intended as a warning. For a few critical seconds, the coverage near the back wall thinned to almost nothing, and Hunter, who had spent the entire ordeal memorizing exactly this kind of opening, did not hesitate. He reached the emergency lighting panel he had identified earlier and pulled the breaker with a motion so quick and quiet that even Grace, watching from only a few feet away, barely registered what had happened until the lights along the back corridor dimmed for exactly 4 seconds, a flicker most people would have dismissed as nothing more than aging wiring. In that brief darkness, Hunter moved. He crossed the distance to the nearest guard with a speed that belonged to a man decades younger, his hand finding the man's throat before the guard could so much as turn his head. The struggle lasted only a moment, brief, controlled, and utterly silent, ending with the guard slumping against the wall behind a row of filing cabinets where no one would notice him for some time. Hunter stripped the man's radio, his keycard, and the folded floor map tucked into his vest pocket, tools that would matter far more in the hours ahead than any weapon could have. He dragged the unconscious guard into a supply closet, arranging him carefully enough that a casual glance through the door would reveal nothing unusual. By the time the lights steadied again, Hunter had returned to his place near the wall, his expression as unreadable as it had been all morning, the only difference a radio now tucked beneath his sleeve and a floor map memorized in the span of seconds. He used the radio sparingly, listening far more than speaking, gathering fragments of conversation that confirmed Aaron's men were stationed at 6 points throughout the floor, 2 more than Hunter had originally estimated. He learned the layout of the server room 2 floors below, the location of a secondary stairwell that Aaron's people seemed unaware of, and the rough timeline Aaron's men were working against, a window of less than 2 hours before the data extraction needed to be complete and the building abandoned. Hunter began guiding a small cluster of employees toward the service corridor near the kitchen pantry, moving them one at a time during moments when the guard's attention drifted elsewhere. He kept his instructions brief, his voice barely above a whisper, telling each person only what they needed to know to stay quiet and stay moving. Grace, watching the careful choreography unfold, began to understand that Hunter was not merely surviving this crisis. He was dismantling it, one careful piece at a time. She found herself stepping into a role she had never expected, relaying small signals to Madison with practiced calm, helping create the appearance of compliance while Hunter worked behind the scenes. Madison, sharp and steady, despite the fear coursing through her, began manufacturing small distractions. knocking over a stack of folders here, asking a guard an unnecessary question there, anything that pulled attention away from the gaps Hunter needed in order to keep moving. The illusion held for nearly 20 minutes before it finally cracked. Aaron, conducting a routine head count of the kneeling employees, paused near the back of the group, his eyes narrowing as he recounted the cluster a second time. One face was missing from the lineup, a guard who should have been standing near the eastern corridor, and no amount of recounting changed the numbers staring back at him. His expression shifted from irritation to something far colder, the calculation of a man who suddenly understood that his perfectly planned operation had developed an unplanned variable. He turned toward his remaining men, his voice low and sharp, ordering a full sweep of every corridor and every closet on the floor. Word spread quickly among the gunmen that someone among the hostages was not what they appeared to be, and within moments the search for that person became the singular focus of every weapon on the floor. Hunter, still positioned quietly near the wall, understood with complete clarity that he had just become the most hunted man in the building. Hunter slipped away from the main floor moments before the sweep began, moving through the service corridor with the kind of economy of motion that left no sound behind him. He had no intention of meeting Aaron's men head-on. A direct confrontation would only invite gunfire into spaces filled with frightened employees, and that was a risk he refused to take. Instead, he chose the strategy that had defined his entire former career: patience disguised as absence. He found the floor's secondary electrical panel tucked behind a maintenance door that even most employees had forgotten existed, and he began cutting power to isolated sections of the floor in short, deliberate bursts. A hallway would go dark for 10 seconds, then return to normal just as a search team reached it, sending them stumbling and disoriented through unfamiliar territory. A stairwell door would lock unexpectedly, forcing 2 guards to backtrack through a longer route that ate valuable minutes from their search. He created sounds where there were none, dropping a metal tray down an empty stairwell to draw 2 guards away from the server room corridor, then circling behind them through a parallel maintenance shaft. Each disruption fractured Aaron's forces further, splitting 6 men into smaller, confused groups who began second-guessing every shadow and every echo. Aaron's composure, so steady at the start of the operation, began fraying with each report that came back empty. His men found no one in the closets, no one in the stairwells, nothing but flickering lights and unexplained noises that made his most experienced operatives nervous in a way gunfire never had. He paced the length of the conference room, his weapon hanging at his side, his jaw tight with a frustration he was no longer bothering to hide from the hostages kneeling nearby. Connor, sensing the operation slipping from its careful timeline, pressed Aaron with growing urgency, insisting that the delay had gone on long enough, and that the only way to regain control was to eliminate the obvious source of leverage. He suggested in a voice low enough that Grace could still hear every word, that killing the CEO in front of the remaining hostages would end any thought of resistance immediately. Aaron considered the suggestion with a coldness that made Grace's stomach turn, though he ultimately decided that her usefulness as a hostage outweighed the message her death might send, at least for now. Hunter, meanwhile, had reached the floor's central control room, a space tucked behind a door marked for maintenance access only, rarely visited by anyone outside the building's engineering staff. Using the access codes he had taken from the guard he disabled earlier, he managed to restore a portion of the floor's internal systems, just enough to bring a single isolated camera feed back online, one that fed directly into an off-site monitoring service the company used for after-hours security. It was not much, a narrow, grainy view of one hallway, but it was a thread leading outside the building, and threads, however thin, could be pulled. He did not dare attempt to restore full communications, knowing the risk of alerting Aaron's men to his location far outweighed any benefit a brief signal might offer. Instead, he used the narrow window of access to send a single coded alert through the monitoring service's emergency line, a sequence he remembered from another lifetime, designed to draw attention without revealing exactly what was happening inside. Whether anyone outside the building would recognize the signal for what it was remained uncertain, but it was the best chance he had of summoning help without exposing the hostages to greater danger. Just as he prepared to retreat from the control room, the radio clipped beneath his sleeve crackled with an urgent transmission that froze him in place. Aaron's voice, sharp and decisive, ordered his men to retrieve a case from one of the vehicles parked in the underground garage, a case that, judging by the tone of the conversation, contained something far more dangerous than additional weapons. Hunter listened as the unmistakable details emerged: wiring, charges, a timer, and his blood ran cold with the understanding that Aaron intended to ensure that if his extraction failed, nothing in this building would survive to tell the story. Hunter moved quickly now, the calculated patience of the last hour giving way to urgency that demanded speed without sacrificing precision. He had 3 objectives tangled together in a way that made each one harder to achieve without endangering the others. He needed to locate and disarm whatever device Aaron's men were assembling. He needed to free the hostages still held near the conference room before panic or violence overtook them. He needed to prevent Connor from extracting the classified data that had brought this nightmare into being in the first place. He reached Grace through a brief window when her guard's attention drifted toward the commotion near the garage entrance, crouching low enough to speak without being seen. He explained in clipped sentences what he needed from her, specifically her ability to remotely revoke server access credentials from a terminal she could reach through the floor's secondary network closet, a task that required her authorization codes and nothing else. Grace, despite the tremor still present in her hands, nodded with a steadiness that surprised even her. Jason Miller, the head of internal security who had spent the early part of the crisis pinned down near the stairwell with 2 other guards, finally found an opening to regroup his remaining staff. He gathered 4 men who had managed to avoid capture, arming them with whatever non-lethal tools remained in the building's emergency kits, fire extinguishers, batons, anything that might create an advantage in close quarters. Word reached him through a brief radio exchange with Hunter, a voice he did not recognize but trusted instantly given the accuracy of the information it carried. Aaron, sensing the operation slipping further from his control, made the decision to split his remaining men into 2 groups, one continuing the search for the missing guard and the intruder responsible for the building's malfunctions, the other assigned to escort Connor toward the server room to finish what they had come to do. The division weakened his position considerably, though Aaron seemed unwilling to acknowledge just how much ground he had already lost. The hardest moment came when Hunter discovered the device and a cluster of hostages were held only 1 floor apart, separated by distance that made it impossible to address both threats at once without help he did not yet have. He weighed the decision for only a few seconds, though those seconds carried the weight of every choice he had made in his previous life, choices that had cost him men he loved and a peace he had spent years trying to rebuild. He chose the hostages first, reasoning that a bomb still being assembled offered more time than people held at gunpoint by men growing increasingly desperate. Grace, learning of his decision through a hurried whisper relayed by Madison, felt something close to disbelief not because she doubted his judgment, but because she understood, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what kind of man had been standing quietly in her hallways for years without anyone noticing. Hunter reached the cluster of hostages just as one of Aaron's men grew impatient enough to raise his weapon toward the group in a gesture meant to intimidate rather than kill. Hunter intervened before the threat could escalate further, disarming the guard with a controlled efficiency that left the man unconscious before the others fully understood what had happened. He guided the freed hostages toward the stairwell Jason's group had secured, passing them off into capable hands before turning his attention back toward the server room and the device still ticking somewhere below. It was in that brief window, while Hunter's focus remained fixed on the hostages, that Connor finally reached the server room himself, flanked by 2 of Aaron's men. He moved with the practiced familiarity of someone who had planned this exact moment for months, inserting a small drive into the primary terminal and initiating a transfer that, once complete, would carry the company's most sensitive research directly into hands that intended to use it against the very government contracts that had built Harrison Dynamics in the first place. The progress bar on the terminal screen began climbing, slow but steady, each percentage point bringing them closer to a loss that could not be undone. Aaron found Hunter before Hunter found him, the 2 men crossing paths in a narrow service corridor as Hunter doubled back toward the server room. For a long moment, neither man moved, each taking the measure of the other, with the wary stillness of professionals who recognize danger when it stood directly in front of them. Then something shifted in Aaron's expression, a flicker of recognition that turned his coldness into something far more personal. He studied Hunter's face for a moment longer, and then said a name that Hunter had not heard spoken aloud in years, a designation rather than a name, the kind given to operators whose identities were never meant to surface in any official record. Aaron's mouth curved into something that resembled a smile but carried none of its warmth. He explained, almost conversationally, that he remembered a compound in a country whose name he refused to say aloud, a failed extraction years earlier where he had been the target rather than the rescuer, and where he had escaped only because the man standing in front of him now had hesitated for half a second too long. Hunter's jaw tightened at the memory, one he had buried alongside so many others. He remembered that mission with painful clarity, remembered the moment his hesitation had allowed a target to slip away, a decision that had haunted him for years even though it had not, in that case, cost any lives directly. He had not known until this moment that the man who escaped that day had built an entirely new career out of exploiting the same skills the government had trained into him, turning loyalty into profit and discipline into cruelty. The revelation rattled something loose in Hunter that he had worked hard to keep buried. This was not merely a hostage situation born of corporate greed. It was, in some twisted way, a reckoning between two men whose paths had crossed once before under circumstances that should have ended very differently. Aaron seemed to relish the irony of it, the idea that fate had placed his old adversary directly in his path once again, this time with far higher stakes and far fewer constraints than either of them had operated under during their government days. Grace, watching this exchange unfold from a distance through a gap in a half-open door, finally understood the full shape of what Hunter had been hiding behind his quiet, unassuming exterior. The pieces clicked into place with sudden, overwhelming clarity, the stillness, the precision, the way he had moved through danger without ever once losing his composure. He was not simply a man with useful skills. He had been, in another life, exactly the kind of operator that countries called upon when no one else could be trusted with a crisis like this one. She understood now why he carried himself the way he did, why his eyes always seemed to track exits and entrances no matter where he stood, why he had never once raised his voice even as the morning collapsed into chaos around them. The calm was not the absence of fear. It was the discipline of a man who had learned at terrible cost exactly how much fear a person could carry and still function. Aaron raised his weapon, and Hunter, without hesitation now, moved to close the distance between them rather than retreat. There was no time left for old guilt or old hesitation, not with hostages still scattered through the building and a device ticking down somewhere beneath their feet. Before either man could act further, a voice crackled through Hunter's radio, urgent and breathless, Jason reporting that the explosive device had been located in a utility closet near the eastern stairwell, its timer already counting down from a number far smaller than anyone had hoped, mere minutes remaining before whatever Aaron's men had built would tear through the floor and everyone still trapped inside it. The fight began without warning, Aaron closing the distance with a speed that belied his age, his fist connecting with Hunter's jaw before either man had spoken another word. Hunter absorbed the blow and answered with a counter that drove Aaron backward into a row of metal shelving, scattering tools and supplies across the narrow corridor floor. The two men grappled through the cramped space, every strike measured and economical, neither wasting motion on anything beyond the immediate need to disable the other. They moved from the corridor into the server room itself, knocking aside equipment as their struggle spilled into the wider space. Aaron fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who had survived by violence alone, while Hunter countered with the discipline of someone trained not merely to win a fight but to end it cleanly. The clash of their two philosophies played out across overturned chairs and shattered glass, neither man gaining a decisive advantage for several long, brutal minutes. Connor, watching the chaos unfold near the terminal where his data transfer continued climbing toward completion, made the decision to abandon the operation rather than risk being caught in the crossfire. He yanked the drive from the terminal the moment the progress bar crossed past the halfway mark, deciding that partial data was better than none at all, and turned to flee toward the stairwell that Aaron's men had left unguarded during the chaos. Grace, who had quietly made her way toward the server room corridor after Hunter's instructions reached her through Madison, intercepted Connor before he could reach the stairwell door. She did not have a weapon, and she did not have training, but she had 4 years of leading a company through difficult decisions, and she used every ounce of that resolve to physically block his path, grabbing his arm with a strength born entirely of fury rather than skill. Connor shoved her aside hard enough to send her stumbling against the wall, but the delay cost him precious seconds that allowed 2 of Jason's security staff to round the corner and tackle him to the ground before he could take another step. In the server room, Hunter finally found the opening he needed, driving Aaron backward into a support column with enough force to knock the weapon from his hand. Aaron lunged for it regardless, fingers brushing the grip just as Hunter's boot came down on his wrist, pinning it firmly against the floor. The fight ended not with a final dramatic blow, but with the quiet, exhausted stillness of a man who finally understood that his plan, however carefully constructed, had unraveled completely. With Aaron subdued and Connor restrained, Hunter sprinted toward the eastern stairwell where Jason had located the device, every second now measured against a countdown he could hear ticking in his mind even before he reached the room. He found the device exactly where Jason's team had reported, wired with more sophistication than he had expected from a corporate sabotage operation, though not so sophisticated that his trained eye failed to identify the critical wire feeding the detonator. His hands moved with the same steady precision that had carried him through every dangerous moment that morning, stripping away the housing, isolating the correct wire, and severing it with seconds remaining on the timer's display, a number that would haunt his thoughts for weeks afterward, despite the danger having already passed. The device fell silent. The building, for the first time in hours, felt almost still. It was only then, in the sudden quiet that followed, that Hunter became aware of the warmth spreading along his side, a wound he had not noticed during the fight, sustained sometime during the struggle in the server room when Aaron's blade had caught him without either man fully realizing it in the heat of the moment. He pressed his hand against the wound and felt his legs begin to weaken beneath him, the adrenaline that had carried him through the entire ordeal finally beginning to fade. Federal agents flooded the building within the hour, summoned by the faint emergency signal Hunter had sent earlier through the off-site monitoring service, a thread that had, against the odds, been noticed and acted upon in time. Agents moved through the executive floor processing evidence, securing Aaron and his remaining men, and questioning the shaken employees who were finally able to leave the building they had feared they might never walk out of again. Connor, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades behind bars, began talking almost immediately, shifting blame onto the network of buyers who had recruited him months earlier through a contact met at an industry conference. He detailed the schematics he had sold, the access codes he had handed over, and the promise of a payment large enough to disappear once the data reached its destination. His confession unraveled a web stretching far beyond Harrison Dynamics, implicating shell companies and corporate insiders at competing firms. Aaron said little, offering only the silence of a man who understood that talking would not change the outcome waiting for him. He was led away in restraints, his expression carrying none of the cold confidence he had walked in with that morning, replaced instead by the resigned weariness of someone whose carefully built operation had collapsed under the weight of one man he had failed to account for. The classified data, thanks to Grace's quick revocation of server access and Hunter's intervention before the transfer could complete, remained almost entirely intact, with investigators confirming that only a small, largely unusable fragment had left the building before Connor abandoned the terminal. The research that had taken years to develop and represented contracts worth billions remained secure, a fact that brought Grace more relief than almost anything else that had happened that day. In the days that followed, news outlets seized on the story with predictable enthusiasm, running headlines about the unnamed hero who had single-handedly dismantled a sophisticated corporate espionage operation and saved dozens of lives in the process. Reporters camped outside the building, eager for interviews, eager for a name, eager for the kind of story that turned ordinary people into legends overnight. Grace, true to a promise she had made to Hunter while he recovered from his wound, refused to confirm any details about his identity or his past, deflecting every question with practiced grace of her own. Hunter, recovering in a quiet hospital room far from the cameras gathered outside the building, wanted none of the attention being offered to him. He declined every request for an interview, every offer of a public ceremony, every suggestion that he step forward and accept the recognition that by any reasonable measure he had earned many times over. He had spent years building a life specifically designed to avoid the kind of visibility now being pressed upon him, and he had no intention of abandoning that life now, not even for the sake of gratitude. Grace visited him during his recovery, sitting beside his hospital bed in a chair too small and too stiff for the long hours she spent there. She asked him gently the question that had been building inside her since the moment she first understood who he truly was. She wanted to know why a man who had walked away from that life, who had buried it so deeply that even his closest co-workers never suspected its existence, would risk everything to bring it back, even for a single morning. Hunter considered the question for a long moment before answering, his voice quiet but certain in a way that left no room for doubt. He told her simply that no one deserved to become a hostage, that the title carried a weight most people never understood until they had lived inside it themselves, and that once he recognized what was happening in that conference room, walking away had never actually been a choice available to him at all. Weeks passed, and the building that had once held its breath through that long, terrifying morning gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms, though nothing about Harrison Dynamics felt entirely the same as it had before. Grace used the crisis as a catalyst for change she had quietly wanted to enact for years, overhauling the company's security infrastructure from the ground up, and replacing outdated protocols with systems designed by people who had proven, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, that they understood real threats far better than any consultant's report ever could. Madison Reed, whose calm thinking and quiet courage had played a far larger role in the crisis than most people outside the building ever realized, was promoted into a newly created position overseeing internal security operations, a role that finally matched the sharp instincts she had always carried but rarely had the chance to use. Jason Miller, recognized for the leadership he had shown in rallying the surviving guards when everything around them had fallen apart, received a promotion of his own, along with a budget and authority he had never been given the chance to exercise before that day. Hunter returned to his quiet life with a determination that surprised even those who thought they understood him by now. He resumed his work as a driver, though Grace, through careful decisions, ensured his schedule allowed flexibility for the small, ordinary moments that mattered most to him: evenings at home, mornings free for routine that had nothing to do with boardrooms or rescue operations. He accepted only a modest bonus from the company, despite Grace's repeated insistence that he deserved far more than gratitude alone could express. He told her with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through that entire ordeal, that he had not done what he did for money or recognition, and that accepting more than was reasonable would feel, to him, like turning a moment of necessity into something transactional, a feeling he simply could not abide. Grace kept her promise. No reporter, no board member, and no curious employee ever learned the full truth of who Hunter Brooks had once been or what he had done that morning to save them all. She carried that secret carefully, understanding instinctively that exposing it would not honor him but would instead strip away the very privacy he had fought so hard to protect, both for himself and for the quiet life he had built outside these walls. In the months that followed, something gradual and unspoken began to grow between them, born not from the drama of the crisis itself but from the steady, ordinary conversations that followed in its wake, brief exchanges in hallways that lingered a little longer than necessary, lunches that began as professional courtesy and slowly became something neither of them rushed to end. Grace found herself trusting him in ways that went beyond what he had done that morning, drawn instead to the steadiness and quiet integrity that had defined him long before anyone knew his name. Hunter, for his part, allowed himself something he had denied himself for years: the possibility that trust could be rebuilt slowly, carefully, without the urgency or danger that had once defined the only kind of intensity he believed he was capable of. Neither of them rushed toward anything resembling a declaration or a promise. They simply allowed the quiet friendship between them to deepen at its own pace, content for now with the simple, steady comfort of knowing the other person was nearby, present, and finally, after everything, safe. If quiet heroes and shocking corporate betrayals pull you in deep, follow along now to uncover the entire story today.